In the spring of 1811, laborers tearing down an old tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia, stumbled upon something that would cast a shadow over the city for generations. Buried beneath the rotting wooden floorboards, they uncovered 8 identical wooden boxes. Inside each one lay a man's wedding ring, and a small vial filled with what looked like medicinal powder. The rings bore different names and dates, but they all shared a terrifying detail. They had once belonged to the husbands of Ruth Holloway, a woman who somehow had managed to outlive 8 wealthy men over the course of 30 years. What investigators later discovered inside those little vials would shake everything they believed about the elegant widow, who had once been the shining star of Virginia society. The local magistrate, horrified by the implications, ordered the discovery sealed from public record. He claimed the matter was too delicate and could bring shame to powerful families if revealed. For more than 2 centuries, this disturbing case remained hidden in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society. But tonight, we are going to unearth the truth about one of America's most calculating and frightening killers. Before we continue with the story of Ruth Holloway and her series of deadly marriages, I want to hear from you. If you're fascinated by untold mysteries of America's past, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. And let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. I always enjoy connecting with fellow history and mystery lovers from across the country. The story of Ruth Holloway doesn't begin with murder, but with tragedy. Tragedy that shaped the fate of 8 men who would eventually become her husbands. Virginia in 1780 was a land forever altered by revolution, still haunted by the aftermath of war. In the fertile tobacco belts surrounding Richmond and Petersburg, grand plantations stretched along the James River. Their white-pillared mansions rose proudly, symbols of the new American prosperity. The Revolutionary War had ended only 3 years earlier, but its scars cut deeply through Virginia's society. Loyalist properties had been seized and redistributed, creating a fresh class of wealthy patriots, while leaving many others poor and ruined. It was in this shifting, unstable world of new fortunes and buried secrets that Ruth Holloway appeared. Ruth arrived in Richmond during the autumn of 1782. She was a striking woman of 28, with auburn hair and eyes like pale winter fog. She claimed to be the widow of Captain Jonathan Holloway, an officer in the Continental Army who had, according to her, died heroically at the Battle of Yorktown. Her story was simple yet heartbreaking. She had lost everything to the war and had come to Virginia hoping for a fresh start, drawn by stories of its wealth, beauty, and generous people. What made Ruth remarkable was not only her appearance, but her intelligence and refinement. She spoke with the polished accent of educated New England, read Latin with ease, and possessed an impressive knowledge of herbs and treatments. At a time when medical care was primitive and trained doctors were few, her healing skills quickly made her indispensable to Richmond's high society. She carried with her a worn leather journal, filled with remedies she claimed had been passed down through generations of her family. Virginia's elite welcomed her warmly. The war had left a shortage of eligible women, as many had died from illness or fled with loyalist relatives. Here was a cultured widow with fine manners who could discuss politics with men and offer healing knowledge to women. Within a few months, Ruth had secured a modest but respectable home on Clay Street. She supported herself by treating a range of ailments, from consumption to nervous fits, earning admiration and trust. Yet beneath Richmond's polite surface, darker forces moved. The war had created not only heroes but profiteers and traitors. Whispered conversations in drawing rooms spoke of men who had switched loyalties for money, of supply convoys mysteriously ambushed, of patriot leaders betrayed to the British. Many suspected the existence of a secret network that had worked with the enemy, though proof was scarce. These men not only survived the war, but grew richer, rewarded with seized properties and government contracts. It was in this world of prosperity built upon betrayal that Ruth Holloway began her deadly relationships with Virginia's most powerful men. She seemed to have an uncanny talent for capturing the attention of the colony's most successful citizens. Tobacco merchants, shipping magnates, wealthy land speculators, even rising political figures. Each of them fell under her spell. Each of them married her in ceremonies celebrated by society. And each of them, without exception, died in circumstances that, while suspicious to modern eyes, appeared natural to their contemporaries. The first whispers of unease came not from the gentry, but from an unexpected source. the enslaved people who lived and worked in the households of Ruth's husbands. They whispered about the strange illnesses that struck their masters after marriage. The symptoms were always the same: stomach pain, growing weakness, and then, inevitably, death. But in a society where the testimony of slaves carried no legal weight, these observations were dismissed as superstition, envy, or idle gossip. The first death took place on a heavy, humid night in August of 1783, less than half a year after Ruth married Colonel Edmund Fairfax, one of Richmond's most successful tobacco merchants. Fairfax was a robust man of 45, known for his energy and health, yet he was found lifeless in his study by his house servant, Jupiter, at dawn on August 15. Later, Jupiter would share with other slaves what he had seen that night, though his account never reached white ears. Around midnight, he had been roused by unusual sounds from his master's study. It was not the typical rustling of papers or clinking of glasses, but something stranger, a low moaning followed by the scrape of a chair. Curious and worried, Jupiter crept to the window. There, in the faint light, he saw Colonel Fairfax doubled over his desk, clutching his stomach, while Mrs. Ruth stood beside him, calm and steady, holding a steaming cup of what looked like medicinal tea. "Drink this, my dear Edmund," Jupiter heard her murmur in her gentle voice. "It will ease your pain. I prepared it with special care." The colonel raised his head with great effort. His face, Jupiter recalled, was ashen, covered in sweat despite the cool night. "The pain? It's worse. Ruth, perhaps we should call Dr. Harrison." Ruth placed a soothing hand on his shoulder. "Nonsense, love. Dr. Harrison is miles away. This remedy has been trusted in my family for generations. Believe me." Her voice, usually charming and melodic, carried something else that night, a note of firmness that allowed no argument. The colonel drank. Within minutes his moans grew louder. Jupiter watched, frozen in horror, as his master convulsed once, twice, then collapsed onto the desk, scattering papers and ink. Ruth stood silently for a long moment, watching with an unreadable expression. Then, with calm and deliberate movements unusual for a grieving wife, she retrieved the cup, rinsed it in a basin of water she had already prepared, and only then began to scream for help. By the time Dr. Harrison arrived at dawn, Ruth was in a state of convincing sorrow, weeping uncontrollably as she clutched her husband's body. The symptoms she described fit what doctors then called acute gastric distress, often caused by spoiled food or stress. She explained that Fairfax had been involved in heated business disputes and had complained of stomach trouble for days. Dr. Harrison's examination revealed nothing alarming. There were no signs of violence, and stomach illness was common in Virginia's climate. He recorded the death as gastric fever and offered heartfelt condolences to the devastated widow. What Dr. Harrison never realized, and what Ruth counted on, was that her so-called family remedies came from a much darker origin. During her journey south, Ruth had spent several weeks in Philadelphia, where she became close to a disgraced physician named Dr. Marcus Wainwright. Wainwright had been expelled from the medical profession after it was discovered he had secretly experimented with poisonous plant extracts, testing them as ways to cause deaths that left no trace. His hidden research had revealed that certain native plants could produce symptoms almost identical to common illnesses, while leaving little to nothing detectable in the body. Ruth not only absorbed Wainwright's forbidden knowledge but improved on it. She discovered that by blending small amounts of certain plant alkaloids with ordinary medicinal herbs, she could create mixtures that truly helped people in tiny doses but became lethal when given in larger amounts or in specific combinations. It was a deadly skill, and Ruth wielded it with precision. Her leather-bound journal did not contain old family remedies as one might expect, but carefully written recipes for murder disguised as healing medicine. The funeral of Colonel Fairfax drew the finest people of Richmond society. Ruth acted the part of a grieving widow with flawless skill, fainting at the graveside and leaning on the arms of sympathetic friends. The colonel's will, written shortly after their marriage, left Ruth a large fortune, including the elegant house on Clay Street and a significant amount of gold and land. Yet Ruth's sorrow did not last long. Within only 3 months after the funeral, she was already seen welcoming the company of another important gentleman, Captain William Randolph, a shipping magnate who had earned his riches supplying the Continental Army during the war. Some whispered about how quickly she had recovered, but they were reminded softly that a woman alone needed protection, and Captain Randolph was known as a man of honor, influence, and wealth. What no admirer of Ruth ever suspected was that her choices of men were never random. Each man she pursued shared a dangerous link. They had all once been part of a secret group that supplied intelligence to British forces during the war. Colonel Fairfax had served as treasurer of this circle, responsible for distributing British gold among American traders. Ruth's sudden arrival in Richmond and her careful marriages were not coincidences at all. They were the first calculated moves in a cold game of vengeance, a campaign that would eventually take 8 lives before it ended. Captain Randolph's death, barely 8 months after he wed Ruth in January 1784, followed the same unsettling pattern. The strong sea captain, known for his unshakable health and his ability to survive the worst storms along the Atlantic coast, was brought down by what Dr. Harrison diagnosed as bilious fever after 3 days of severe stomach pains and weakness. By then Jupiter, the slave who had once worked for Colonel Fairfax, had been sold to another household, yet the enslaved community had its own channels of communication. Rumors traveled fast about another of Ruth's husbands dying from stomach troubles. Old Caesar, who worked in the Randolph household, noticed details similar to those Jupiter had seen. His master fell ill after drinking medicinal tea from Ruth. Her calmness never broke during his agony, and she refused to allow any physician other than Dr. Harrison to be called. It was Caesar, however, who stumbled on something important. While cleaning the captain's study after the death, he found a small vial hidden behind a loose board in the wall. Inside was a fine white powder with a faint smell of almonds mixed with bitter herbs. Later, he showed it to Jupiter during a chance meeting at the Richmond market. Jupiter's face turned pale. "Same thing I saw at Colonel Fairfax's place," he whispered nervously. "Found one just like it in the kitchen after the master died. When I showed it to the cook, she made me toss it in the river and warned me never to mention it again." From then on, the slaves quietly began keeping their own records, sharing knowledge within their hidden network. They noted Ruth's unusual habits. She always insisted on preparing her husband's medicines with her own hands. She locked her medical supplies in a special chest never touched by servants, and she displayed an uncommon knowledge of wild plants from the Virginia countryside. Most unsettling of all, she often took long, solitary walks in the surrounding woods, returning with baskets of herbs she guarded closely. Meanwhile, Ruth's position in Richmond society only grew stronger after each tragedy. Captain Randolph's will left her even richer than before, and her public image as a loyal wife who endured cruel misfortune brought her sympathy everywhere. The leading families of Virginia competed to welcome her into their gatherings, seeing her both as an object of pity and as a desirable companion. Her third marriage was to Judge Thomas Henley, a well-respected member of the Virginia House of Delegates and a man deeply involved in shaping the new state legal system. Their romance was short but intense, with the judge often declaring that Ruth had restored his belief in love after the loss of his first wife during the war. They married in June 1785 in what was considered one of the finest weddings of the season. Judge Henley lived only 7 months as her husband. His sudden death in January 1786 was especially shocking because it happened during a dinner party at their home in front of a dozen of Richmond's most notable citizens. He had been in high spirits all evening, entertaining guests with tales of constitutional debates and his hopes for Virginia's future. Then Ruth handed him a special digestive tonic, explaining it was an old recipe from her mother. Moments later, the judge showed signs of violent distress. Dr. Harrison, called once more to treat yet another of Ruth's stricken husbands, began to develop quiet suspicions. But suspicion was not evidence. Ruth had been in full view of others during her husband's decline. The symptoms resembled those of many natural diseases, and she enjoyed flawless social standing. To accuse a woman of such reputation, beauty, and wealth without undeniable proof would have been unthinkable in court. And so the grim pattern continued. Husband number 4, plantation owner George Carrington, died of acute dyspepsia in 1787. Husband number 5, merchant Samuel Bradford, passed from what was called nervous fever in 1788. Husband number 6, banker Edward Custis, was said to have died of gastric apoplexy in 1789. With each death Ruth's fortune swelled, her influence deepened, and her displays of grief became more theatrical. Yet with each marriage whispers of strange coincidences grew louder. After Edward Custis's passing, new threads began to appear for those watching closely. Dr. Marcus Wainwright, a disgraced physician Ruth had once known in Philadelphia, arrived in Richmond in late 1789. He claimed he sought a fresh beginning in Virginia. He rented a modest house on the edge of town, saw few patients, and lived quietly. Yet Caesar, who now worked near Wainwright's home, noticed that Ruth often visited the doctor's residence at dusk, slipping away only after nightfall. Those visits were not for friendship, they were secret business. Wainwright had discovered Ruth's true identity, and her secret crusade. He had not come to Richmond for redemption but for profit. He understood her mission and wanted his share of her fortune. Their deal was simple: he would supply her with more advanced poisons, and she would give him a portion of each inheritance. But Wainwright made a dangerous mistake. He believed Ruth needed him too much to resist his greed. He thought his demands for money and his suggestions to expand their work into other cities would be accepted. He never grasped that Ruth's killings were not about greed at all. They were driven by a furious need for justice, a fire she would not allow to be cheapened by anyone else's hunger for wealth. The chain of deaths that began with Colonel Fairfax was heading toward a violent climax. Ruth's list of traitors was nearly finished. Only 2 names remained: Dr. Harrison himself, who had secretly been the medical contact of the organization, and the most powerful figure of all, Governor Edmund Randolph, the man who had organized the entire treasonous network from within the colonial government. But in the autumn of 1790, something unexpected arrived to upset her careful plan. A new figure entered Richmond society, Captain Jonathan Hale, a former Continental Army intelligence officer. Officially, he was there to settle property disputes left after confiscations from Loyalists. Unofficially, he was tracking whispers of a hidden network that had betrayed America during the war. His investigation had already uncovered the names of several suspected members, and he noticed with sharp interest that many of them had died mysteriously in recent years. What made Captain Hale especially dangerous to Ruth was not only his sharp military training that allowed him to notice patterns, but also his access to secret intelligence files that contained names and suspicions of possible traitors. Unlike the local authorities, who thought the strange events were only a string of unfortunate coincidences, Hale began to connect the dots and saw the outline of a planned mission of elimination. His first serious clue came through his friendship with Dr. Harrison. During a casual evening conversation about the unusually high number of wealthy men who had died of stomach troubles in the past few years, the doctor admitted his growing unease about the repeating pattern of deaths among Ruth's husbands. What unsettled Harrison most was the fact that each man had died even though they appeared to be getting proper medical attention from their caring wife. "It is most peculiar, Doctor," Harrison confessed one evening over dinner in his home. "Mrs. Holloway seems to suffer the worst luck with her husbands. And yet she is one of the most attentive wives I've ever met. She knows more about remedies and medicine than many doctors I know, and she is always eager to assist in caring for her sick spouses. If I did not know better, I would almost swear she was trying to save them rather than—" He stopped suddenly, unwilling to speak his suspicion aloud. Captain Hale leaned forward with curiosity. "Rather than what, Doctor?" Harrison shook his head slowly. "Forgive me, I should not speak badly of a woman who has suffered such repeated loss. Still, in my 30 years of practice, I have never witnessed so many similar deaths within one household." That very night, Captain Hale began his own quiet investigation into the past of Ruth Holloway. What he uncovered chilled him. There was no record of a Captain Jonathan Holloway in any Continental Army files. No officer by that name had died at Yorktown or in any other battle. The woman who called herself Ruth Holloway had come to Richmond with a completely false identity, and her real background remained hidden in mystery. At the same time, Ruth had already chosen her 7th target, Merchant Prince Alexander Fitzhugh, one of the richest men in Virginia and a secret member of the traitorous society she was methodically destroying. Fitzhugh had built his fortune by passing information about American supply lines to British troops, helping them plan raids that had cost countless patriot lives. His betrayal was especially cruel because he had used his official position as a supplier for the Continental Army to spy on American weaknesses and movements. Ruth's courtship of Fitzhugh started in the winter of 1790, and followed the pattern she had already perfected. She presented herself as a lonely widow in need of companionship and safety, while gradually showing him her deep knowledge of finance and trade. Fitzhugh, a widower himself, found himself drawn to her mix of vulnerability and intelligence. Within 3 months, he had proposed marriage. But this time, Ruth faced unexpected resistance. Captain Hale had quietly shared his suspicions with a handful of respected citizens, and soon rumors began spreading within Richmond's close social circle. When Fitzhugh announced his engagement, several friends urged him to reconsider. "Alexander, surely you have noticed the troubling pattern," tobacco magnate Robert Carter told him during a private talk at the Richmond Club. 7 husbands, 7 unusual deaths. Even if one believes Mrs. Holloway is simply cursed with bad fortune, surely such repeated tragedy deserves a closer look. Fitzhugh's reply revealed how skillfully Ruth had worked her influence. "Gentlemen, I understand your concerns, but I must remind you that your doubts rest only on coincidence and gossip. Mrs. Holloway has been examined by the most respected doctors and questioned by fair magistrates. Time after time, she has been cleared of any wrongdoing. Are we truly going to punish a woman because life has handed her repeated misfortune?" What Fitzhugh did not realize was that Ruth had already been studying his own secret crimes through records she had stolen from Dr. Marcus Wayright's files. Wayright, who had been trying to blackmail Ruth into sharing her wealth, had been digging into her victims. He uncovered that all of Ruth's husbands were part of a shadowy society known as the Covenant of Prosperity. This group had traded intelligence with the British during the war in return for financial rewards after peace was made. The fact that Wayright now knew about the covenant convinced Ruth that he had become too dangerous to keep alive. One cold February night in 1791, Marcus Wayright was discovered dead in his house, apparently poisoned by one of his own experimental brews. The magistrates decided that the disgraced physician had taken his own life to escape being exposed for his unlawful experiments. Ruth attended the funeral with proper sadness, but inside she felt only relief. The only person who could have linked her to rare poisons was now gone. With his death, the last outside threat to her work had vanished. On March 15, 1791, Alexander Fitzhugh and Ruth Holloway married in a ceremony far smaller and quieter than her earlier weddings. Captain Hale was there as a guest, observing her closely. She appeared calm, content, and utterly convincing in her role as a happy bride. If she was indeed guilty, her ability to hide it was remarkable. The marriage lasted just 4 months. On July 20, 1791, Alexander Fitzhugh died after a short illness that started with stomach pain and ended in full collapse of his body. Dr. Harrison, now very suspicious though still without hard evidence, conducted the most thorough examination of his long career. He found nothing he could legally call proof of poison, but privately he was convinced Alexander had been murdered. Ruth's act of grief reached almost artistic levels. She fainted at the graveside, needed smelling salts to revive her, and spent weeks locked away in sorrow. Yet those closest to her began noticing subtle changes. She carried herself with greater confidence, more command, and seemed less interested in pretending to be the weak and helpless widow she had always played before. With Fitzhugh gone, Ruth now controlled a fortune that placed her among the wealthiest women in Virginia. Even more important to her mission, she had destroyed 7 of the 8 members of the Covenant of Prosperity. Only one remained. Dr. Harrison himself, the physician who had acted as the group's medical advisor and who now, ironically, posed the greatest risk to Ruth's own freedom. But Ruth did not expect that Captain Hale's tireless search would uncover not only her false identity, but also the deeper truth behind her deadly quest. In the captured files of a British intelligence officer, Hale found reports about an American spy network that mentioned a woman known only as the Widow. This mysterious woman was said to have lost her husband to Patriot forces and had vowed revenge against those who betrayed him. Cross-checking this with official records, Hale made a shocking realization. There had indeed been a Captain Jonathan Holloway, but he was not the man Ruth had claimed him to be. He was in fact a British spy, working deep inside the Continental Army. He had been caught and executed in 1779, betrayed by members of his own spy ring, the very group that later became the Covenant of Prosperity. The truth was now clear. Ruth Holloway was not avenging a patriot's betrayal. She was seeking revenge for the death of a traitor. Her husband had been a British agent, and his execution had been fully justified. The men she was killing were guilty of treason themselves, but not against Britain. They had turned on him to protect themselves. This revelation changed everything. Ruth was not a patriot widow on a quest for justice. She was a loyalist, carrying out a secret campaign of vengeance against American heroes who had helped secure independence. Her murders were not acts of justice, but acts of treason. Captain Hale's discovery came at a critical point, for he soon learned Ruth had already begun her final and boldest pursuit. Her last target was not Dr. Harrison, as Hale first assumed, but Governor Edmund Randolph himself, the most powerful man in Virginia, and the hidden leader of the Covenant of Prosperity. For months Ruth had carefully worked to gain his attention, and slowly she had succeeded.